There are moments when you can feel the world changing beneath your feet. Not dramatic moments, no earthquakes or explosions, just subtle shifts that somehow, mark a before and after in your community's story. For our small town, that moment came in the spring of 1985, when they broke ground on what would become Riverside Mall, and everything we thought we knew about our little corner of Massachusetts began to transform. My name is Paul, and I was 30 years old that year, running my cafe on Main Street, married to Jessica for 6 years, with a 3-year-old daughter named Emma. Life was good, predictable, comfortable. Our town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where businesses had been family-owned for generations, where Friday nights meant high school football and Saturday mornings meant the farmers' market in the town square. And then the mall came, and nothing was ever quite the same again. The first whispers started in late 1984. A development company from Boston had purchased 40 acres of farmland on Route 9, just outside town limits. Nobody thought much of it at first. Developers were always buying land, making plans that never materialized. But then the plans got filed with the town planning board, and suddenly everyone was talking about it. A shopping mall. A real enclosed shopping mall, like the ones in Boston or Springfield, but right here in our town. 2 stories, 100 stores, a food court, a movie theater with 6 screens. An anchor department store on each end, J.C. Penney and Sears. Parking for 2,000 cars. The town meeting in December 1984 was packed. The high school auditorium was standing room only, with people spilling out into the hallways. Everyone wanted to hear about this mall, to understand what it would mean for our community. The developers came with their presentation, slick boards showing architectural renderings, economic impact studies, projections of jobs created and tax revenue generated. They painted a picture of progress, of our town joining the modern age, of opportunity and growth and prosperity. The promised numbers were staggering. 300 permanent jobs, 1,500 construction jobs, millions of dollars in annual tax revenue, drawing shoppers from a 30-mile radius, making our town a regional destination instead of just a spot on the map between larger cities. The high school principal spoke in favor. "Think of what that tax revenue could do for our schools," he said. "New computers, updated textbooks, maybe finally fixing the leaky roof in the science wing." The mayor spoke in favor. "Jobs for our young people, so they wouldn't have to leave town to find work." The president of the Chamber of Commerce spoke in favor. "This would put us on the map, make us competitive with neighboring towns." But not everyone was enthusiastic. Tommy Chun stood up, representing the Downtown Merchants Association. He was 42 by then, running the hardware store his father had started decades ago. He spoke carefully, respectfully, but his concern was clear. What would happen to the downtown businesses when people could buy everything they needed at the mall? How could small, family-owned stores compete with national chains and their bulk purchasing power and advertising budgets? Martha Henderson's husband Harold, she'd passed away 2 years earlier, and Harold had never quite recovered, spoke about the character of the town, about how Main Street had been the heart of our community for over 100 years, about how a mall might be convenient, but it lacked soul, lacked history, lacked the personal connections that made a town more than just a collection of buildings. Frank Morrison, who'd opened his auto repair shop 10 years earlier, worried about traffic. Route 9 was already busy. What would happen when you added thousands of mall shoppers every day? Would they widen the road? Install new traffic lights? Who would pay for all that infrastructure? The debate went on for 3 hours. Proponents argued for progress and economic growth. Opponents argued for preserving what made the town special. People got heated, voices were raised, old friendships were tested by disagreement. In the end, the mall was approved. The town council voted 4-3 in favor, and the developers promised to break ground in the spring. I sat in that auditorium, listening to both sides, genuinely torn. Part of me, the businessman part, understood the appeal. The mall would bring customers to town, and some of those customers would surely find their way to my cafe. Economic growth benefited everyone, right? But another part of me, the part that had grown up in this town, that had built my business on Main Street, that valued the relationships with my neighbors and fellow merchants, felt uneasy. Something about it felt wrong, felt like we were trading something precious for something merely profitable. Jessica and I talked about it for hours that night after Emma was in bed. She understood both sides too. Her teaching job at the elementary school would benefit from increased tax revenue, but she loved our downtown, loved being able to walk to the hardware store or the bookshop or the pharmacy and know the owners by name. We decided to adopt a wait-and-see attitude. Maybe it would be fine. Maybe the mall and downtown could coexist. Maybe we were worrying about nothing. The groundbreaking ceremony in April 1985 was treated like a celebration. The mayor was there with a golden shovel. The developers brought a marching band. Local news crews came out to cover it. They'd set up a big tent with refreshments, and half the town showed up out of curiosity. Emma sat on my shoulders, watching the ceremonial first scoop of dirt. She was too young to understand what was happening, but she loved the band and the excitement. Jessica stood beside me, her hand in mine, and we watched our town step into a new era. Construction began immediately. The 40 acres were transformed seemingly overnight. Trees cleared, land graded, foundations poured. Every day driving past on Route 9, you could see the progress. The skeleton of the building rising, steel beams reaching toward the sky, the massive footprint taking shape. The town became obsessed with watching it go up. People would drive out of their way just to see the latest developments. Kids on bicycles would ride out to the construction site and watch from the road. The local newspaper ran weekly updates with photos and construction timelines. By summer, you could see the shape it would take. The two-story structure, the distinct sections for each anchor store, the central atrium where the food court would be. It was massive, bigger than anything in our town, bigger than our high school, maybe bigger than all the downtown buildings combined. The developers started recruiting staff in August. Job fairs at the high school gym, lines of applicants wrapping around the building. 300 permanent positions became a very real attraction for a town where good jobs had always been scarce. Teenagers who'd previously worked at gas stations or fast food places could now get jobs at the Gap or Radio Shack. Adults who'd been commuting to other towns for work could now find employment minutes from home. My part-time employee, a woman named Sarah who'd been with me for 2 years, gave her notice. She'd been hired as assistant manager at the mall's cookie company store, making $3 more an hour than I could afford to pay her. I didn't blame her. She had 2 kids and an ex-husband who barely paid child support. She needed that money. I wasn't alone. Tommy Chen lost his best salesperson to the hardware department at Sears. The bookstore lost both their clerks to Walden Books. The clothing boutique that had been on Main Street for 30 years lost their entire staff to various mall stores. The grand opening was scheduled for November 15, 1985, right before the Christmas shopping season. The developers had planned it perfectly to capture all that holiday spending. The week before opening, the excitement in town was electric. The local newspaper published a special section, a directory of every store, a map of the mall layout, interviews with store managers. Radio stations ran countdowns. The high school even organized a field trip so students could tour the mall before it opened to the public. Jessica and I took Emma to the pre-opening preview for local residents. Walking through those doors for the first time was like stepping into another world. The scale of it was overwhelming. Ceilings 2 stories high, the central atrium with a fountain and skylights, stores stretching in every direction. It was climate-controlled, spotlessly clean, filled with the smell of new construction and retail possibility. Emma's eyes went wide. She'd never seen anything like it. To her 3-year-old mind, it must have seemed like a palace. She wanted to look at everything, touch everything, run through those wide corridors that seemed to go on forever. We walked past stores selling things we'd never had access to before: The Limited, Victoria's Secret, KB Toys, software, etc. National chains we'd only seen in magazines or on TV, now right here in our town. The food court had a dozen options: McDonald's, Sparrow, Great American Cookie Company, Oriental Express. You could eat cuisine from around the world without leaving our little Massachusetts town. I watched Jessica's face as we explored. She was excited, I could tell, drawn to stores she'd never shopped at before, enticed by the convenience of having everything in one climate-controlled space. But I also saw something else in her expression, a flicker of guilt, maybe, or concern. She caught me watching and squeezed my hand. She asked what I was thinking, and I told her the truth. This was impressive, undeniably so, but it also felt impersonal, corporate, interchangeable with any other mall in America. If you blindfolded someone and dropped them in this mall, they wouldn't know if they were in Massachusetts or California or Texas. There was nothing uniquely ours about it. The grand opening day was chaos. People lined up at 6 in the morning for the 9 o'clock opening, even though it was freezing November weather. The parking lot filled completely by 10. Traffic on Route 9 backed up for miles. Police had to direct cars, manage the flow of humanity descending on this new temple of commerce. The developers had orchestrated it like a carnival. Balloon animals for kids, face painting, a radio station broadcasting live, prizes and giveaways at every store. The mayor cut a ribbon. The marching band played again. Local celebrities, our weatherman, the morning radio DJ, the high school football coach, made appearances. For the first few weeks, the mall was the only thing anyone talked about. People compared notes on which stores they'd visited, what deals they'd found, what they'd bought. Teenagers made it their new hangout spot, spending entire weekends walking the corridors, sitting in the food court, spending their allowance money on arcade games and Orange Julius. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, downtown began to empty. It started with foot traffic. Main Street, which had always been busy on Saturdays, started feeling quieter. The hardware store that used to be packed with customers on weekend mornings had empty aisles. The clothing boutique that had done steady business for 3 decades suddenly had more staff than shoppers. Tommy Chan came into the cafe one morning in December looking exhausted. His sales were down 30% compared to the previous year. People were buying their tools and supplies at Sears or the mall's hardware store because it was convenient, because they were already there shopping for other things, because the selection was bigger even if the service wasn't as knowledgeable. The bookstore owner, Margaret Sullivan, stopped by that same week. Her sales were down even more, 40%. How could she compete with Walden Books and their massive inventory and their discount bestsellers? She'd built relationships with her customers over 20 years, knew their reading preferences, special-ordered books they requested. But apparently that wasn't enough when the mall offered convenience and lower prices. One by one, the downtown merchants came to the cafe. My place had become an unofficial gathering spot, a place to commiserate and strategize. Frank Morrison said his auto shop was fine. You couldn't get your car repaired at the mall, but he worried about what the changing downtown would mean for all of us. Sarah Henderson reported that the pharmacy her family had run for 50 years was struggling. People were filling prescriptions at the mall's CVS because it had longer hours and accepted more insurance plans. By February, the first casualty arrived. The clothing boutique that had been on Main Street since the 1950s announced they were closing. The owner, a woman named Dorothy who'd taken over the store from her mother, stood in her shop surrounded by going out of business signs and cried as she talked about 3 generations of serving our community, all ending because she couldn't compete with the Limited and the Gap. The bookstore followed in March. Margaret tried everything: sales, special events, book clubs, but nothing could stem the tide of customers flowing to the mall instead of downtown. On her last day of business, I brought her coffee and pie from the cafe, and we sat in her empty store surrounded by boxes of remaindered books, and she talked about the children she'd introduced to reading, the book clubs that had met there every month, the community she'd helped build through shared love of literature. The fabric store closed in April, the toy store in May, the shoe repair shop, which had been there since 1923, in June. Each closure felt like a small death. These weren't just businesses, they were institutions, landmarks, pieces of our town's identity. The fabric store had supplied materials for 3 generations of home sewers. The toy store had been where every kid in town got their first bicycle. The shoe repair shop had been run by the same man for 40 years, and he knew every customer by name, knew their shoe sizes from memory, and they were being replaced by nothing. Empty storefronts with "For Lease" signs in the windows. Blank spaces where community gathering spots used to be. Tommy Chan organized a downtown merchants meeting in July. 15 of us gathered in the back room of his hardware store. The survivors, the ones still hanging on, trying to figure out how to adapt to this new reality. The conversation was somber. Everyone's sales were down. Everyone was struggling. The mall wasn't the boost to the entire town's economy that had been promised. Instead, it was cannibalizing downtown, pulling customers away from Main Street and concentrating all that spending in one corporate location. We talked about solutions, better marketing, special events, longer hours, better window displays. But we all knew the fundamental problem. We couldn't compete on price or selection with national chains, and we couldn't offer the convenience of one-stop shopping. What we could offer, what we'd always offered, was personal service, community connection, local ownership. But apparently that wasn't enough anymore. My cafe was holding steady, thankfully. People still needed breakfast and lunch, and the mall's food court, while popular for dinner and weekends, wasn't pulling away my morning coffee crowd or my lunch regulars. But I watched my fellow merchants struggle, and I worried about what would happen when enough of them closed that downtown stopped being a destination at all. The town council finally acknowledged the problem in August. They formed a downtown revitalization committee, allocated some funding for streetscape improvements, approved a small business loan program. But it felt like too little, too late. You couldn't revitalize a downtown that was bleeding to death. Harold Henderson came into the cafe one afternoon that September. He was 76 by then, slowed by age and grief. He'd been coming to my place every morning for years. It was part of his routine, part of how he coped with Martha's absence. He sat at his usual spot at the counter, and I poured him coffee without asking. He looked around the cafe, at the half-empty tables, at the absence of the usual afternoon crowd, and told me something I've never forgotten. He said that when they debated the mall at that town meeting, he'd warned people about this. Not that anyone had listened to an old man mourning his dead wife, but he'd seen it happen before, in other towns, in other eras. Progress, he said, always came with a price. The automobile had killed small-town main streets once before, in the 20s and 30s, when people could suddenly drive to bigger cities to shop. Those main streets had adapted, had found new purposes, had survived. But this was different. The mall wasn't just offering convenience. It was offering an entirely different experience, a controlled environment that felt safe and modern and new. And newness, he said, always won, at least at first. People chased the new thing, the exciting thing, without thinking about what they were leaving behind until it was gone. He asked if I'd thought about opening a second location in the mall. The food court had space for local businesses, not just national chains. I could expand, capture some of that mall traffic, diversify. I'd considered it. The mall management had actually approached me about it. But something held me back. Opening a food court location would require significant investment, equipment, staff, inventory, and it would mean splitting my attention, my energy, my very presence between two locations. The cafe worked because I was there, because it was personal, because customers knew they'd see me when they came in. A mall location would just be another food court store. Convenient, sure. Maybe even profitable. But it wouldn't be mine, not in the way the cafe was mine. By the first anniversary of the mall's opening in November 1986, downtown had lost 8 businesses. 8 stores that had served our community for decades, gone, replaced by empty storefronts and fading memories. The mall, meanwhile, was thriving. Every store was occupied. Sales were exceeding projections. The developers were already talking about an expansion. The movie theater was packed every weekend. The food court was a constant hub of activity. Teenagers still congregated there, treating it like the new town square. And that was the thing that struck me most. The mall had become the center of our community. Not Main Street, not the town square, but this corporate-owned, climate-controlled shopping center on Route 9. If you wanted to see people, you went to the mall. If you wanted to gather, you went to the mall. The social center of our town had shifted, and it had happened so quickly that most people didn't even notice. Jessica and I took Emma to the mall sometimes. We weren't immune to its convenience, its variety, its appeal. But every time we went, I felt a pang of something like grief. Not for what was, necessarily, but for what was being lost. The serendipitous encounters on Main Street, running into neighbors and stopping to chat. The personal relationships with merchants who knew your name and your preferences. The sense that your spending was supporting your neighbors, keeping money in the community instead of sending it to corporate headquarters in some other state. The mall was efficient. It was convenient. It was modern and clean and climate-controlled. But it was also anonymous, corporate, interchangeable. And that anonymity came at a cost we were only beginning to calculate. I'm 73 now, and that mall is still there on Route 9, though it's changed over the years. Some stores have closed, others have opened. The movie theater got renovated. They added a gym and a few restaurants to stay competitive. It's adapted, evolved, survived in ways that downtown struggled to do. And downtown, it eventually found a new identity. The empty storefronts slowly filled again, but with different types of businesses: art galleries, antique stores, restaurants, craft breweries, yoga studios. The hardware store survived by focusing on service and expertise rather than trying to compete on price. My cafe not only survived but thrived, becoming even more of a community gathering place as other social spaces disappeared. But it took almost 20 years for downtown to recover, to find its new purpose. And some businesses never came back. Some types of retail, clothing, books, toys, fabric, are just gone from Main Street, permanently relocated to malls and shopping centers or later to online retailers. Young people today don't remember downtown before the mall. To them, this is normal: the mall for shopping, downtown for dining and entertainment. They don't remember when Main Street had a bookstore and a toy store and a clothing boutique. Don't remember when the pharmacy was locally owned, when you could get your shoes repaired instead of buying new ones, when every business on the street was a neighbor you knew by name. And I suppose that's how change happens. Gradually, then suddenly. One decision at a time, one closed business at a time, until you wake up one day and realize your community has fundamentally transformed into something different from what it was. The mall brought jobs, as promised. It brought tax revenue and convenience and variety. It brought national brands and food court options and six-screen movie theaters. It brought progress, by certain definitions. But it also brought loss. Loss of local ownership, of personal connections, of community character. Loss of a downtown that had been the heart of our town for over a century. Loss of something intangible but precious. The sense that we were a community of neighbors rather than just a collection of consumers. I don't think the mall was evil, exactly. It was just change, the kind of change that's happened to small towns across America over and over in different forms. The railroad changed towns. The automobile changed them again. The mall was just another iteration of that pattern. But standing in my cafe now, 40 years later, serving coffee to the grandchildren of the customers I served in 1985, I can't help but wonder, did we choose this change? Or did it choose us? And if we could go back to that town meeting in December 1984, knowing what we know now, would we vote the same way? I honestly don't know. Progress and preservation, growth and character, convenience and community. These tensions are eternal, and there are no easy answers. But I do know this. Every time a community faces a decision like the one we faced, they should think carefully about what they're gaining and what they're losing. Because you can't get it back once it's gone. The businesses close, the buildings sit empty, the relationships dissolve, and something essential about the character of a place disappears. Maybe that's acceptable. Maybe that's just the price of progress, and the benefits outweigh the costs. But maybe, it's worth fighting to preserve what makes a place unique, even if it means sacrificing some convenience and economic growth. That's the question we faced in 1985. That's the question every community still faces, in different forms, every single day. And the answer we choose defines not just what our towns look like, but who we are as communities.